Bruno froze at the cold fireplace, then let out a growl so quiet it made his battle-hardened owner stop breathing. The old cabin shuddered as Luke forced the swollen door open. A burst of icy air rolled over his boots, and somewhere inside a single drip echoed through the darkness. Bruno ignored the empty room, staring only at the stone fireplace with every hair along his back standing up. Luke had survived Afghanistan, but nothing had prepared him for what his dog sensed inside that cabin. What do you think Bruno noticed first? The cabin door refused to move the first time Luke Bennett pushed against it. It groaned softly, swollen from years of mountain snow and spring rain, but held fast as though it had forgotten people still existed. Luke stepped back onto the weathered porch and studied the warped frame. Bruno stood beside him, ears turning toward the silent woods instead of the cabin. The German shepherd's amber eyes swept the tree line before settling on his owner. "One more time," Luke muttered. He leaned his shoulder into the door with the same steady commitment he had once used to force open compound gates half a world away. Old hinges screamed. The wood cracked loose all at once. The door burst inward. Cold air spilled from the darkness inside. It was colder than the October wind outside. Luke stopped in the doorway. His breath drifted white before his face. No insulation, no heat. No one had lived here for a very long time. Sawtooth National Forest stretched for miles around him, endless ridges covered with lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and granite cliffs already dusted with early snow. The nearest paved road sat almost 14 miles behind him. Cell service had disappeared over an hour ago. The old pickup truck parked outside had barely survived the washed-out logging road leading here. The lawyer in Boise had called this place an expensive mistake. He had repeated the words 3 separate times. "Your uncle left unpaid property taxes, structural damage, and access issues," the attorney had said while sliding the deed across his desk. "Mr. Bennett, walking away is probably the smartest decision you've made in years." Luke had almost smiled. The smartest decisions he'd made in Afghanistan hadn't saved everyone either. So he took the deed. Because a worthless cabin was still more than the cardboard shelter behind a truck stop where he and Bruno had slept the week before. He stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath worn combat boots that had seen too many countries and not enough peace. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight, cutting between cracked shutters. The cabin was smaller than he'd imagined. One room, a stone fireplace, a narrow loft, 2 broken windows facing east toward a valley that disappeared into blue mountains. Someone had built this place with careful hands decades earlier. Someone had also walked away. Luke slowly turned in place, letting years of military habit do what it always did. Windows, corners, ceiling, exits, weak points. His eyes paused on water stains spreading across rough pine boards overhead. Roof leak. Then another. 2 separate stains. Different ages. The roof wasn't failing. It had been failing for years. His right hand unconsciously brushed the empty place where a rifle sling had once rested across his chest. Old habits never asked permission. They simply returned. Outside, a raven cried somewhere above the trees. The sharp call echoed through the valley. Luke's shoulders tightened before his mind caught up. For half a heartbeat, he wasn't standing in Idaho. He was back inside a mud compound outside Kandahar, waiting, listening, counting seconds after distant mortar fire. A warm nose pressed gently against the back of his hand. He blinked. Bruno. The dog looked up without making a sound. Luke let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he whispered. "I'm here." The tension eased from his shoulders. He walked deeper into the cabin. Most of the furniture had been abandoned where it stood. A narrow table, 2 handmade chairs, a cast-iron stove rusting beside the fireplace. Shelves lined one wall, empty except for a chipped enamel mug and an old kerosene lantern coated with dust. Nothing valuable. Nothing anyone would steal. Exactly what the county records had described. He crouched beside the fireplace. The stonework caught his attention, not because anything seemed unusual, because everything seemed unusually well maintained compared to the rest of the cabin. The mortar joints looked older, but cleaner, as though someone had repaired this section long after the walls had begun falling apart. He reached toward one of the stones. Before his fingers touched it, a low growl rolled through the room. Luke froze. Bruno never growled without reason. The German shepherd wasn't looking toward the windows. He wasn't watching the forest. He wasn't staring at the open door. His eyes were fixed on the fireplace. Every muscle in his body had gone rigid. His ears stood forward, tail perfectly still. The quiet growl deepened inside his chest. Luke slowly withdrew his hand. "What is it, buddy?" Bruno didn't answer with movement. He simply stared. Not at the firebox. Lower. Near the base where the largest stones met the floor. Luke followed his gaze. Nothing. Just old granite darkened by smoke and time. He knelt lower. The cabin had become completely silent. No wind. No birds. Even the old wood seemed to stop creaking. Bruno took one cautious step closer. Then another. His nose lifted into the air. He inhaled once. Twice. The growl returned. Softer now. Almost uncertain. Like he recognized something hidden beneath decades of dust, but couldn't understand why it was still there. Luke looked from the dog back to the fireplace. For the first time since accepting the inheritance, he no longer believed this cabin was simply abandoned, and neither did Bruno. Luke stayed crouched beside the stone fireplace for another minute, studying the uneven surface while Bruno refused to look anywhere else. The dog wasn't barking or scratching. He simply stood motionless, breathing slowly through his nose as though memorizing a scent too old for any man to notice. "Not today," Luke said quietly. Winter was closer than whatever mystery waited inside those stones. Experience had taught him one lesson above all others: survive first, ask questions later. He picked up his canvas pack and stepped back outside. The afternoon sun had already slipped behind the western ridge, leaving long shadows stretching across the clearing. At this elevation, darkness arrived early, and cold followed close behind. The first priority was the roof. Luke walked the perimeter of the cabin with the same deliberate pace he had once used clearing compounds overseas. Every few steps he stopped, looked, listened, then moved again. Years had passed since Afghanistan, yet his feet still preferred cover over open ground, and his eyes instinctively searched for high ground before looking anywhere else. The cabin sat in a natural bowl surrounded by thick stands of pine. A narrow game trail curved down toward a creek somewhere below the ridge. Large granite outcrops overlooked the clearing from two directions. Good observation points, good places for wildlife, or people. He made a mental map without realizing it. The roof looked worse from outside. Several cedar shingles had curled upward, exposing black patches beneath. Moss covered the north side where snow probably lingered well into spring. One corner sagged just enough to worry him. Repairable, if the weather held. His old pickup still carried a faded blue tarp, a claw hammer, roofing nails, and 2 bundles of salvaged cedar shingles he'd picked up months earlier, never expecting they'd finally have a purpose. Bruno wandered only a short distance before stopping near a cluster of waist-high brush. The dog lowered his head, sniffed, then looked uphill. Luke watched him for several seconds. "What have you got?" Bruno didn't move. Luke approached carefully. There, almost hidden beneath fallen needles, was a narrow footpath barely visible beneath years of brush. Not an animal trail. Too straight, too deliberate. Someone had once walked this route often. He marked it in his memory and continued working. By sunset, the tarp covered the largest section of damaged roof. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't permanent, but it would keep rain outside for a while longer. Inside, Luke coaxed life into the old cast-iron stove after cleaning years of soot from the chimney opening. The first smoke rose cleanly through the flue. He nodded once. One less thing trying to kill him. Dinner consisted of canned beans warmed over the fire and half a piece of cornbread from the cooler in his truck. Bruno accepted his own meal without complaint, before settling beside the stove. The warmth slowly spread through the cabin. For the first time in months, Luke found himself sitting beneath a roof that belonged to no one else. Night settled quietly over the mountains. Wind whispered through tall pines. The stove clicked as the iron expanded. Luke rolled out his sleeping bag against the far wall, where he could see both the door and the windows without turning his head. Old habits. Always old habits. He closed his eyes. Sleep never arrived all at once anymore. It came in short pieces. 20 minutes. 30 if he was lucky. Sometime after midnight, a sharp crack echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. Luke was on his feet before he was fully awake. His flashlight was already in his hand. His breathing had gone silent. Bruno stood beside him instantly. Both of them faced the door. Luke waited. 5 seconds. 10. 15. No second sound. Slowly, reason pushed through memory. Not incoming fire. Not contact. Just timber. Probably a heavy branch snapping beneath early frost. He let out a long breath. His pulse took longer to listen. Bruno leaned lightly against his leg until the tension eased from Luke's shoulders. "Thanks," Luke whispered. The dog returned to his bed without another sound. Morning broke clear and cold. Thin frost coated the clearing. Luke checked the thermometer hanging outside the door. 29 degrees. Winter wasn't asking permission anymore. After coffee boiled in a dented enamel pot, Luke filled 2 bottles and headed downhill toward the creek. The water ran clear over smooth granite. He knelt beside it, watching the current before filling 1 bottle. He'd boil it later. Trust nothing. Verify everything. Another habit that refused to leave. Bruno drank first, then suddenly lifted his head. Every muscle tightened. His ears pointed toward the trees upstream. Luke followed the dog's gaze. Nothing moved, only sunlight drifting through pine branches. Still, something felt wrong. On the walk back, Bruno left the trail again. This time he pushed through the brush covering the narrow path Luke had noticed the day before. Luke followed. The forgotten trail wound uphill behind the cabin before disappearing beneath fallen trees. It hadn't been used in years, yet someone had recently broken fresh branches, trying to force a vehicle through farther down the slope. Luke knelt, pressed 2 fingers into the damp earth. Fresh tread. Truck tires. Less than a week old. He slowly stood. According to the county map, this road had been abandoned for almost 15 years. Someone had been here anyway. Bruno stared down the hidden road without making a sound. Luke looked back toward the lonely cabin waiting beyond the trees. The mountain suddenly felt much less empty than it had yesterday. He took one last look at the tire tracks before covering them lightly with pine needles. Not to erase them, to see whether someone would disturb them again. It was the kind of quiet trick his squad had used years ago when they wanted to know who had moved through an area after they left. Nothing elaborate, just enough to answer a question without asking one. Bruno watched him work, then turned toward the cabin. The dog never pulled on the leash. He simply started walking. Luke followed. The next morning he drove into the small town of Stanley, 40 minutes away over rough forest roads. The pickup rattled over every washboard stretch, its suspension complaining louder than the engine. He parked beside a weathered hardware store where pickup trucks outnumbered cars 3-1. Inside, the smell of cut lumber, machine oil, and fresh coffee filled the air. Luke bought roofing felt, galvanized nails, a new splitting wedge, and a roll of heavy fencing wire. "You fixing that old Bennett place?" the cashier asked while ringing up the supplies. Luke looked up. "You know it?" The woman smiled faintly. "Everybody around here knows it." She lowered her voice. "Didn't think anybody would ever live there again." Before Luke could ask another question, the front bell chimed. A tall man in an expensive waxed jacket walked inside. Late 50s, clean boots, silver pickup parked out front. The kind of man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom more than a logging town. He noticed Luke immediately. "You must be Luke Bennett." Luke didn't answer right away. The man offered his hand. "Harold Mercer." Luke shook it once. The grip was firm. Practiced. "I own Mercer Resources. I've heard the name. I'm sure you have." Harold smiled politely while studying Luke with careful eyes. "I heard your uncle left you the cabin." Luke nodded. "Congratulations." There was something unusual about the way Harold said it. Not warmth. Measurement. "I'd be interested if you ever decide to sell." Luke rested a box of roofing nails on the counter. "I just got there." "I understand." Harold glanced toward the mountains outside the window. "Hard place to make a living." "I've lived in harder." The older man smiled again. "This land doesn't have much value, so I've been told." "Then maybe don't spend too much fixing it." He handed Luke a business card. "If you change your mind, call me before winter." Luke slipped the card into his shirt pocket without looking at it. Harold tipped his hat politely and walked out. The cashier waited until the truck disappeared. "He isn't the first one." Luke looked over. "The first what?" "The first person who wanted that land." She folded the receipt before handing it across the counter. "For the last 10 years, folks have shown up asking about that property." "Why?" She shrugged. "Funny thing is, nobody ever buys it." Luke frowned. "They all make offers. And they leave. Any reason?" She shook her head. "Not one they ever shared." The drive back felt longer. Clouds had begun gathering over the western peaks. Snow clouds. By late afternoon, Luke reached the clearing. Bruno was already barking from inside the truck. Not excited. Warning. Luke stopped the pickup 50 yards short of the cabin. Something wasn't right. The front door stood open. He was certain he'd closed it. The wind wasn't strong enough to pull it open. He killed the engine. Silence. He rested one hand on Bruno's shoulder. "Stay." The German shepherd whined softly, but obeyed. Luke approached on foot. Every instinct returned without invitation. Watch the windows, check reflections, listen before moving. No birds, no voices, only the breeze brushing through pine needles. He reached the porch. The lock plate had fresh scratches. Someone had forced the latch. Luke stepped inside. Nothing looked different. At first, the sleeping bag still lay beside the stove. The canned food remained stacked beneath the table. His backpack sat where he'd left it. Nobody had taken his tools, his coffee pot, his spare clothes. His rifle case remained untouched beneath the cot. Whoever entered hadn't been looking for supplies. Luke slowly walked the room. His eyes stopped. The heavy wooden table beside the fireplace had moved. Only 6 inches. Most people wouldn't notice. Luke did. The scrape marks across the floorboards were fresh. He crouched. One chair sat crooked, Dust had been disturbed around the hearth. Someone had spent time here. Specifically, right here. Bruno suddenly pushed past Luke and walked directly to the fireplace. His nose moved across the lowest row of stones, back and forth. Again. Then he looked at Luke, not barking, waiting. Luke placed one hand on the cold stone. The mortar felt older than the surrounding wall. Someone else had noticed that too. Whoever broke into the cabin hadn't searched the shelves. They hadn't opened cabinets. They hadn't touched the truck outside. They had come for one place. The fireplace. Luke slowly reached into his pocket and unfolded Harold Mercer's business card. For several seconds he stared at the name. Then he folded it once more and slipped it back into his pocket. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a truck engine started. It was too far away to see, close enough to hear. Then it disappeared into the mountains. Bruno let out a low, steady growl. His eyes never left the stones beneath the fireplace. Luke knelt without taking his attention off the room. Years of training had taught him one rule that had kept him alive more than once. Never become so focused on one mystery that you forget the danger around you. He listened. Nothing. Only the soft hiss of wind slipping beneath the old door and the occasional pop from the stove. Satisfied no one remained inside the cabin, he set his flashlight on the floor so its beam washed across the base of the fireplace. The lowest stones looked ordinary enough. Granite, old mortar, decades of soot. Yet one section carried less smoke staining than the rest. Not cleaner, newer. Someone had rebuilt this portion years after the original fireplace was finished. Bruno stepped closer. His nose brushed one particular stone. Then he sat down, waiting. Luke ran his fingers across the mortar joint. It felt smoother than the others. Whoever repaired it had known exactly what they were doing. He walked outside and returned with a narrow, cold chisel and a mason's hammer he had found hanging inside the woodshed. "I hope your nose is better than my eyes," he murmured. Bruno answered by softly tapping the same stone with one paw. Luke smiled for the first time in days. Fair enough. The first strike echoed through the empty cabin. Dust drifted down from the chimney. The second chipped away old mortar. The third loosened the stone enough that Luke could grip its rough edge with both hands. It resisted, then suddenly shifted. A cool breath of stale air escaped from the darkness behind it. Luke carefully removed 2 more stones until a narrow cavity appeared inside the chimney base. Not large, just deep enough for someone to hide something they intended to protect. He reached inside. His fingers brushed cold metal. Not loose. A rectangular box. He worked it forward slowly until it slid into the firelight. It was an old military surplus ammunition box, painted olive green beneath years of soot. Rust marked the hinges, but the rubber seal around the lid remained intact. Waterproof, intentional. Someone had expected it to survive for decades. Luke rested it on the table. Bruno stood beside him, tail still, eyes fixed on the box. The latch opened with a dry, metallic click. Inside lay several objects wrapped in faded oilcloth. The first was a stack of black and white photographs. Luke picked one up carefully. His uncle stood beside the very same cabin nearly 30 years younger, wearing heavy wool clothes and smiling beside another man Luke had never seen before. Between them sat a German shepherd. Large, broad-chested. Its ears stood proudly forward. Bruno leaned closer. His nose lingered over the photograph. He gave one quiet whine. Luke frowned. "Looks like one of your family." Beneath the photographs rested a folded topographic map marked with careful pencil lines. Trails, streams, elevation notes. Several places circled without explanation. One mark appeared again and again. A single letter. S. Under the map sat a leather-bound notebook, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. Luke opened the cover. The handwriting inside was neat but compact. Every line looked deliberate. Not a diary, not stories. Observations. Spring flows strong through April. Avoid the northern slope after heavy rain. Keep wood stacked off the ground. Check roof before first snow. The entries read more like instructions than memories. Advice from someone who understood every inch of this mountain. Luke turned another page. More notes. Weather. Animal tracks. Water levels. None of it sounded dramatic. Every line sounded earned. Outside, daylight slowly faded behind the ridge. The cabin grew quiet again, except for the soft crackle of burning cedar. Luke kept reading. Some pages contained small hand-drawn sketches showing rock formations and forgotten trails. Others described places where elk crossed during early winter. One page simply read, "Never hurry in these mountains. They'll always outlast you." Luke smiled faintly. His uncle sounded exactly like the man he remembered from childhood. Quiet, patient, never wasting words. Then he reached the final written page. The handwriting slowed. Each letter looked heavier, as if written by tired hands. Only one sentence filled the center of the page. "If the shepherd trusts you, keep reading." Luke instinctively looked toward Bruno. The German shepherd sat perfectly still beside the table, watching him. Not the notebook. Him. Luke turned the page. Instead of another paragraph, there was a single hand-drawn survey line stretching across a rough map of the property. Halfway across the page, someone had crossed out the official boundary in thick pencil. Beside it, his uncle had written only 4 words. "The county line is wrong. Nothing else. No explanation. No reason." Just those 4 words. Luke stared at them for a long moment. Outside, darkness settled over the mountains. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped sharply. Bruno suddenly lifted his head toward the eastern wall, not growling, listening, somewhere far beyond the trees. A truck door slammed. Then silence returned. Luke slowly closed the notebook. For the second time since arriving, he realized the mountain held 2 separate mysteries. One had been hidden by his uncle. The other was still walking somewhere outside. Luke banked the fire until only a bed of glowing coals remained. He pulled the curtains over the cracked windows, not because they offered much protection, but because light traveled farther than people realized in mountain country. Bruno lay near the door instead of the stove. That alone told Luke enough. The dog always chose warmth. Tonight, he chose the entrance. Luke placed the notebook beside his sleeping bag and reread the last page under the beam of his flashlight. The county line is wrong. No explanation, no measurements, just certainty. He unfolded the old topographic map again. The official property line printed in faded black ink curved around the eastern slope before turning sharply toward the creek. Someone, his uncle judging from the handwriting, had drawn another line in pencil several hundred yards farther north. Not much farther, but enough. If the notebook was correct, nearly 4 acres had never belonged where the county believed they did. Luke folded the map carefully. Questions could wait until daylight. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of worn steel. Cold mist drifted through the pines, carrying the scent of wet cedar and fresh earth. Luke boiled coffee while Bruno finished breakfast, then packed the notebook, compass, binoculars, and an old military map case that had survived 2 deployments and a decade in storage. The notebook mentioned 3 landmarks: a split granite outcrop, a lightning-scarred pine, a survey marker hidden beneath moss. No coordinates. Just observations made by someone who knew the mountain better than any map. Luke started uphill. He walked without hurry. Every few hundred yards he stopped, listened, looked behind him. Years after leaving the army, he still moved through unfamiliar ground, using short bounds between cover, unconsciously avoiding skylines whenever possible. Bruno ranged 20 yards ahead, never farther. The dog would disappear behind brush for a few seconds, then glance back to make sure Luke followed before continuing. By late morning, they found the granite formation exactly where the notebook described it. Two enormous slabs leaning together like folded hands. Nearby stood an old ponderosa pine with a scar spiraling nearly 20 feet up its trunk, where lightning had struck decades earlier. Luke smiled quietly, so he wasn't guessing. Bruno barked once, not an alarm, a signal. Luke crossed the slope toward him. Half buried beneath moss sat a weathered stone marker no taller than his knee. The metal survey cap on top had nearly disappeared beneath rust. Luke brushed away years of dirt. His eyes narrowed. The stamped number matched the county survey listed on the deed. But something was wrong. The marker leaned several inches east. Too much. Natural settling rarely shifted survey monuments that far without disturbing the surrounding soil. Luke knelt lower. The earth around its base looked different. Someone had dug here long ago. Not recently. Years, maybe decades. He took several photographs before opening the notebook again. One margin note caught his attention. Never trust one marker. Always find the next. He looked around. No second marker. Only dense timber. Bruno suddenly stiffened. His ears pointed uphill. The dog wasn't looking at wildlife. Luke knew the difference. Bruno's tail stayed perfectly still. Luke slowly removed the binoculars from his pack. He scanned the ridge. Nothing. Another sweep. Still nothing. Then, movement. A flash of sunlight reflecting off glass. Gone. Not an animal. Someone watching from higher ground. Luke lowered the binoculars. He said nothing. Instead, he turned casually as if he'd finished exploring and began walking downhill. After 50 yards, he quietly stepped behind a cluster of fir trees and waited. Bruno pressed silently against his leg. 30 seconds, a minute. Then came the faint crunch of boots. Whoever had been watching expected Luke to keep walking. Instead, Luke watched a man appear briefly between the trees, nearly 100 yards upslope. Dark jacket, orange knit cap, too clean to be a hunter. The stranger stopped where Luke had been standing only moments before. He looked around, studied the survey marker, then quickly disappeared back into the forest. Luke never followed. Afghanistan had taught him something else. Never chase someone who already chose the ground. He waited another 5 minutes before continuing toward the cabin by a different route. Halfway home, Bruno suddenly lunged forward. Before Luke could react, the German shepherd slammed hard into his thigh. The impact knocked Luke sideways. At that exact instant, a dead lodgepole pine crashed down from the hillside. The rotten trunk exploded across the trail where Luke had been standing less than a heartbeat earlier. Branches shattered against nearby rocks. Dust and pine needles filled the air. Luke hit the ground shoulder first, rolling instinctively behind a fallen log. His breathing stopped. His eyes searched the slope. Contact? Ambush? Nothing. Only silence. The tree had finally given way after years' of rot. Bad timing, or very good luck. He pushed himself upright. Bruno. The dog limped toward him. Blood dotted the pine needles. A jagged piece of rusted metal hidden beneath the fallen trunk had sliced deep into Bruno's front leg. The shepherd never whimpered. He simply sat down, holding the injured paw above the ground. Luke dropped to one knee immediately. His hands moved without hesitation. Trauma kit, pressure bandage, sterile gauze, antiseptic. Every movement came from memory older than thought. Easy, buddy. Bruno rested his head against Luke's shoulder while the wound was cleaned. Only once did he flinch. Luke wrapped the leg carefully, checking circulation before tying the final knot. When he finished, he pressed his forehead gently against Bruno's. "You just saved my life." Bruno answered by licking the back of Luke's hand once. Then, despite the pain, he stood, ready to keep walking. As Luke gathered the scattered equipment, his eyes fell on the fallen tree. Embedded in its splintered trunk was an old iron survey spike. It hadn't come from the tree. It had been driven there by someone years ago. Another marker. Another piece of a boundary that wasn't where it was supposed to be. Luke left the iron survey spike exactly where he had found it. He photographed it from 3 different angles, then laid a broken branch across the trail 20 feet away. Not to mark the spike, but to tell himself later whether someone else had come looking. The mountain had stopped feeling abandoned. Now it felt watched. Bruno limped beside him all the way back to the cabin, favoring his left front leg, but refusing to slow down. Every few minutes, Luke knelt to check the bandage. The bleeding had stopped. The wound was clean. The old field dressing from his trauma kit was holding exactly as it had been designed to. "Still tougher than me," Luke said quietly. Bruno answered with a slow wag of his tail. Clouds rolled over the western ridge before sunset. By nightfall, the rain arrived. Not a gentle mountain drizzle, a steady, cold rain that hammered the patched roof hour after hour. Luke added another cedar log to the stove and listened. One drip, then another. The tarp was holding, but only barely. Water found every weakness eventually. He pulled the notebook onto the table and opened it beside the lantern. Most pages contained practical observations: snow depth, water flow, animal crossings, how to stack firewood so it stayed dry through February. The handwriting never wasted words. Luke admired that. His uncle had written the way old soldiers spoke, only what mattered. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the valley. A second later, lightning flashed through the eastern window. For an instant, the cabin disappeared. The stove, the walls, the notebook. Everything dissolved into white light. Then came the sound, a deep crack that echoed through the mountains. Luke's hand closed around the flashlight before he realized he had moved. His breathing shortened. His eyes searched corners that no longer existed. The rain against the roof became rotor blades. The thunder became outgoing artillery. Someone shouted. Not outside. Inside his own memory. "Move! Move!" Another explosion. Dust. Smoke. The smell of burned diesel. A radio calling broken coordinates. Luke found himself crouched beside the fireplace without remembering crossing the room. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it. His fingers gripped the flashlight as though it were still the rifle he'd carried across dry valleys half a world away. The cabin was gone. For one terrible moment, Afghanistan had returned. Something warm touched his wrist. Bruno. The German shepherd had crossed the room despite his injured leg. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply rested his head against Luke's forearm. Steady, solid, present. Luke blinked. The rotor blades faded. Only rain remained. The smell of smoke became cedar again. His breathing slowed one careful breath at a time. He scratched gently behind Bruno's ears. "You brought me back." The dog closed his eyes. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, silence slowly returned. Luke poured another cup of coffee even though it was nearly midnight. Sleep wasn't coming. Not tonight. He turned another page of the notebook. The handwriting changed slightly here. Less instructional. more personal. Only one short paragraph filled the page. There are things in these mountains that greedy men always notice before honest ones do. If you ever learn what I learned, don't rush to tell anyone. Not because it's worth money, because money is exactly what will destroy it. Luke read the paragraph twice, then a third time. His uncle had underlined the final sentence. The next page held a rough sketch of the property. The official survey line appeared in black ink. Another line, drawn later in pencil, crossed nearly 4 acres outside the recorded boundary. Beside it, his uncle had written, "The papers are wrong. Leave them wrong until you understand why." Luke leaned back in the chair. Harold Mercer wanted the land. Someone had searched the fireplace. Someone had watched the survey marker. And his uncle had deliberately hidden the truth. Not to become rich. To keep someone else from becoming rich. He turned another page. Most of it was blank except for one symbol. A single capital letter. S circled once, then again, then a third time. Below it, in smaller handwriting, almost squeezed into the margin, were 6 words. Follow water before you follow stone. Luke unfolded the topographic map beside the notebook. There, near the northern drainage, the same symbol appeared beside a narrow stream that wasn't marked on the official county survey. A forgotten creek, or perhaps a spring. Whatever it was, the county records ignored it completely. Bruno suddenly lifted his head. His ears rotated toward the eastern wall. Luke listened. At first, nothing. Then, very faintly, an engine. Not close, not on the main road. Somewhere deeper in the forest. It idled for only a few seconds before disappearing beneath the sound of rain. Luke stood and quietly extinguished the lantern. Darkness filled the cabin. Only the orange glow from the stove remained. He moved to the window without using the flashlight. Outside, the clearing looked empty. Rain drifted through the beams of moonlight breaking between clouds. No headlights. No movement. Still, someone had been out there. He could feel it the way he had once sensed danger before seeing it. Bruno remained beside the window, completely silent, watching the darkness with him. Luke looked back at the notebook lying open on the table. His uncle hadn't hidden a treasure map. He had hidden instructions, and every page seemed to point toward one place. The mysterious S hidden somewhere beyond the wrong boundary. Luke waited until the rain stopped. Mountain storms rarely lasted all day, but they changed everything after they passed. Trails softened. Fresh tracks held their shape. Broken branches looked brighter against the dark forest floor. He stepped onto the porch just after sunrise. The air smelled of wet pine, cedar, and cold stone. Bruno limped out beside him. The bandage on his front leg was still clean, though his stride carried a slight hitch. "You stay here," Luke said. Bruno looked at him, then calmly walked past him. Luke sighed. "I figured you'd say that." The notebook lay folded inside the waterproof map case tucked beneath his jacket. His uncle had drawn only enough to guide someone who already knew how to read the land. No straight lines, no exact distances, only landmarks. A spring that never froze, a split boulder shaped like an arrowhead, a dead white pine struck by lightning twice. Luke found the spring first. Unlike the creek below the cabin, this water emerged directly from fractured granite, clear enough to see every pebble at the bottom. He filled one bottle, cold enough to numb his fingers. He remembered the note. "Follow water before you follow stone." The spring fed a narrow stream that disappeared through thick stands of lodgepole pine before turning east. Bruno moved ahead, nose low to the ground. Every few yards he stopped, looked back, waited. Luke followed the same slow pace. The terrain grew steeper. Moss-covered fallen logs. The forest became quieter. Even birds seemed reluctant to cross this section of the mountain. Nearly an hour later, Bruno stopped beside an enormous boulder split cleanly down the middle. Arrowhead. Exactly as the notebook described. Luke unfolded the map again. From here, the next landmark should have been less than 200 yards north. A weathered stone marker hidden beneath moss. He searched for almost 15 minutes. Nothing. Then Bruno barked once. Short. Sharp. Luke turned. The dog wasn't looking at the ground. He was staring at an old cedar stump almost completely swallowed by ferns. Luke walked over. The stump looked ordinary, until he noticed 3 small chisel marks cut into one side. Perfectly straight. Deliberate. Military training had taught him that people rarely noticed what they weren't expecting. He brushed away wet leaves around the stump. A flat stone appeared beneath them. Not natural. Too square. Luke lifted it. Underneath lay a rusted survey cap no larger than the palm of his hand. He cleaned away years of dirt. The numbers matched neither the county records nor the first marker. Instead, a tiny letter had been stamped beneath the survey number. Luke's pulse quickened. This is it. He looked around slowly. The notebook had been right again. Bruno suddenly left the marker and climbed a narrow rise behind it. His limp seemed forgotten. The German shepherd sniffed along the crest before stopping beside a cluster of waist-high rocks stacked one above another. Not random. Placed. Luke counted them. 3. Exactly 3. A small cairn. His uncle had mentioned nothing about it directly, only enough clues for someone patient enough to notice. Luke knelt beside the stones. The top rock shifted easily. So did the second. The third was heavier. When he finally rolled it aside, a narrow cavity appeared beneath. Inside rested a tightly wrapped bundle covered in dark oilcloth. Dry, perfectly preserved. Luke carefully lifted it free. It weighed less than he expected. Bruno sat beside him without making a sound. Luke untied the old leather cord. Inside lay 3 items. A small glass vial filled with dark metallic fragments, a folded handwritten letter, and several yellowed geological survey sheets. The first page of the letter began simply. Luke, if you're holding this, then Bruno trusted you. Luke stopped reading. His eyes moved back to the photographs he'd found days earlier in the cabin. The old German shepherd beside his uncle. The same alert ears. The same broad chest. The same calm eyes. Not Bruno, but close enough to mistake at first glance. His uncle continued. The shepherd in the photographs was named Duke. His bloodline stayed with our family for generations. If one of them accepts you, don't ignore what they notice. They've saved more Bennett men than pride ever has. Luke slowly reached over and rested his hand against Bruno's neck. The dog leaned gently into it. The geological reports beneath the letter carried government seals from more than 30 years earlier. Most pages described groundwater, rock formations, core samples, nothing unusual. Until the final report. Across the bottom, someone had stamped Confidential. A single paragraph had been circled in red pencil. Mineral deposits confirmed beneath the northeastern ridge. Extraction would likely alter underground water movement, feeding multiple natural springs throughout the watershed. Luke read the sentence twice. His uncle hadn't hidden gold. He hadn't hidden silver. He had hidden the reason no one should ever dig here. A gust of wind swept through the trees. Bruno's head lifted instantly, his ears locked toward the valley below. Luke listened. Voices. Far away. 2 men. Not close enough to understand. Close enough to know they were climbing. Luke quickly wrapped the documents back inside the oilcloth. The mountain had finally revealed its truth. Now someone else was coming to take it. Luke slipped the letter, the survey reports, and the glass vial back into the oilcloth without rushing. Panic had no place in the mountains. His uncle's notebook had repeated that lesson in different words over and over again. Bruno stood motionless beside the stone cairn. The German shepherd's ears tracked the voices drifting uphill through the timber. Two men, one carrying something metal. The occasional clink echoed between the trees. Luke looked downhill instead of toward the sound. Never stare directly at the threat. Another habit that had survived Afghanistan. He whispered, "Let's move." Bruno stayed low as they eased away from the cairn. Luke deliberately chose the steeper route through a stand of young fir trees, where branches broke up their outline. The wet ground muffled their footsteps, while the thicker cover forced anyone following to slow down. Halfway down the slope, Luke paused behind a granite outcrop and looked back through the binoculars. Two figures appeared near the spring. One wore an orange knit cap, the same man Luke had seen watching the survey marker days earlier. The other carried a long pry bar across his shoulder. Neither looked like hunters. The man in the cap pointed toward the split boulder. They were following the same landmarks. "They know enough," Luke murmured, "but not everything." Bruno gave a quiet huff. Luke smiled faintly. "Exactly." He led Bruno farther west before circling back toward the cabin from an unexpected direction. By the time they reached the clearing, late afternoon sunlight had broken through the clouds. Everything looked normal, until Luke looked at the roof. The blue tarp he'd secured only 2 days earlier had partially peeled back, not from wind. The knots were gone, cleanly cut. He climbed onto the porch. The front door remained locked. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. Someone hadn't entered. Someone had wanted the weather to do the damage instead. Luke climbed onto the roof. The cut ends of the nylon rope hung neatly beside the ridge. Knife. One smooth pull. No fraying. Whoever had done it understood exactly how long Rain would need to finish the job. He retied the tarp using steel cable instead of rope. If someone wanted to cut through that, they'd need bolt cutters. As he climbed down, Bruno suddenly froze. His head snapped toward the north tree line. The dog's body became rigid. Luke didn't ask why. He simply followed Bruno's eyes. Nothing. Just shadows beneath towering pines. Then, a flicker. Someone moved between two trunks. Gone. Luke didn't chase. Instead, he quietly entered the cabin and closed the door. He waited beside the eastern window where the afternoon sun reflected against the old glass, making it difficult for anyone outside to see in. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Bruno never left the doorway. Finally, a boot stepped into the clearing. Only one man. Orange cap. He walked slowly around the cabin, pretending to study the structure. His eyes never lingered on the walls. They kept drifting toward the chimney, toward the fireplace. The stranger crouched near the foundation, running one hand across the stone. Luke watched every movement without breathing. The man pulled out a phone, snapped 2 quick photographs, then walked toward the woods. Before disappearing, he stopped beside the truck. He looked at the license plate, memorized it, then vanished into the trees. Luke counted another full minute before opening the door. Fresh boot prints crossed the damp soil. Size 11. Deep heel strike. Heavy build. Bruno sniffed each print carefully. Then he began pulling hard toward the northern trail. Easy. The dog ignored him. Bruno's growl deepened. Not fear, urgency. Luke unclipped the leash. Bruno shot into the timber. Despite the bandaged leg, he moved with astonishing speed. "Bruno!" Luke ran after him, Branches slapped against his jacket as he followed the dog through dense brush. The forest opened suddenly into a narrow game trail. 50 yards ahead stood the man in the orange cap. His back was turned. He never heard Bruno coming. The German shepherd lunged, not to bite, to stop him. The man spun in panic. The pry bar swung in a wide arc. Luke shouted, "No!" The steel struck Bruno across the shoulder with a sickening crack. The dog tumbled through wet leaves without making a sound. The man stumbled backward, dropped the pry bar, then fled downhill into the trees. Luke reached Bruno seconds later. The shepherd struggled to stand. Failed. His breathing came fast. Luke's hands were already searching. No skull injury. Good. Eyes tracking. Good. Then he found the wound. The blow had split the skin across Bruno's shoulder, and blood soaked steadily through the fur. Luke tore open another field dressing. His fingers worked automatically. Direct pressure. Compression wrap. Immobilize. Bruno finally let out a low whine. It was the first sound of pain Luke had ever heard from him. "You stay with me." Luke's voice barely rose above a whisper. "You hear me?" Bruno blinked once, then slowly pushed his nose into Luke's chest as though apologizing for getting hurt. Luke swallowed hard. "You don't apologize." He rested one hand against Bruno's neck. "You saved me before." His eyes lifted toward the trail where the stranger had disappeared. The footprints were already filling with cold rain. Luke looked back at the cabin beyond the trees. This wasn't trespassing anymore. Someone was willing to hurt an innocent dog to reach whatever had been hidden in those mountains. And for the first time since arriving in Idaho, Luke stopped wondering whether Harold Mercer was involved. He started wondering how far Harold was willing to go. He lifted Bruno into his arms. The German shepherd weighed nearly 80 pounds, but adrenaline made him feel lighter. Bruno rested his head against Luke's shoulder, breathing hard, his injured front leg hanging limp against Luke's jacket. "Hang on," Luke whispered. "We're almost home." The walk back to the cabin felt twice as long. Dark clouds rolled over the Sawtooth Mountains, swallowing the last patches of blue sky. A bitter wind rushed through the pines, carrying the sharp scent of snow long before the first flakes appeared. Winter had finally arrived. Luke kicked the cabin door shut behind them and laid Bruno gently on the old wool blanket beside the stove. The dog's ears twitched as Luke unpacked his trauma kit. Years ago, in Afghanistan, he'd learned to ignore shaking hands. Hands could shake. Training couldn't. He clipped away the matted fur around Bruno's shoulder. The wound was ugly but clean. No bone exposed, no heavy arterial bleeding. He flushed it with sterile saline until pink water ran across the wooden floor. Bruno never tried to pull away. He only watched Luke's face. "I know," Luke said softly. "It burns." He threaded a curved needle with black nylon suture. His fingers moved steadily, despite the knot tightening somewhere deep inside his chest. 3 stitches, then 4, then 5. Each one drew the torn skin together. When he finished, he applied antibiotic ointment before wrapping the shoulder with fresh gauze and a compression bandage. Only then did Luke finally sit back. Bruno stretched his neck forward and rested his muzzle against Luke's knee. Luke closed his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Outside, snow began falling. Not gently. Heavy, wet flakes driven sideways by mountain wind. Within an hour, the clearing disappeared beneath white. Luke checked every window, added another log to the stove, secured the shutters, then climbed onto the roof one final time to tighten the steel cables holding the tarp. The wind nearly knocked him off twice. By the time he climbed back inside, his beard had frozen white. Bruno watched him from the blanket, lifting his head just enough to make sure Luke had returned. "I wasn't leaving you." The dog settled again. Night came early. The storm only grew stronger. Wind pushed against the cabin walls until the old logs groaned in protest. Snow struck the windows like handfuls of gravel. Luke sat beside the stove reading his uncle's notebook while Bruno slept. Every few minutes he looked up, checked the bandage, listened to the breathing. Normal. Slowly improving. Sometime after midnight, Bruno's eyes opened, his head lifted. Luke noticed immediately. "What is it?" The German shepherd struggled to stand. His injured shoulder trembled. Luke gently pressed him back down. "Easy." Bruno ignored him. He limped toward the front door, then stopped, not barking, listening. Luke heard it a second later, not outside, above them. A deep crack echoed through the roof, wood under strain. He stood instantly. Another crack. Longer this time. Luke grabbed the flashlight. The beam swept across the ceiling. Nothing. Then a thin line of snow drifted through one corner, where the rafters met the chimney. Too much weight. The wet snow was loading the old roof faster than the supports could carry it. Luke reached for his coat. "We have to get outside." Bruno didn't move toward the door. Instead, the dog turned sharply and limped toward the back wall. Luke frowned. Wrong way. Bruno barked once. The first bark since he'd been injured. Short, urgent. Then he grabbed the cuff of Luke's jacket and pulled. Luke hesitated. A fraction of a second. Then trusted the dog. They moved together toward the rear exit. Luke had just reached the door latch. The cabin exploded behind him. The sound was deafening. A massive ponderosa pine, uprooted by wind and heavy snow, crashed through the front half of the roof. Timbers snapped like dry bones. The old chimney held. Everything around it collapsed. The place where Luke had been standing less than 5 seconds earlier disappeared beneath shattered rafters and thousands of pounds of timber. A cloud of snow, dust, and splintered wood filled the cabin. Luke threw himself over Bruno as debris rained around them. Silence followed. Only the wind remained. Luke coughed hard. His flashlight had rolled somewhere beneath broken boards. Moonlight poured through the gaping hole where the roof had once been. He looked back. The stove still stood. Barely. The cot. Gone. The chair beside the fire. Crushed. The exact spot where Luke usually slept had vanished beneath the fallen tree. His throat tightened. He looked at Bruno. The German shepherd stood beside him, breathing hard despite the pain in his shoulder. The dog had known. Not by magic, not by instinct alone. He had heard the old rafters shifting long before Luke recognized the danger. Luke wrapped both arms around Bruno's neck. For the first time in years, his composure broke. He buried his face against the dog's thick fur. "You saved me again." Bruno leaned into him without making a sound. Outside, the storm slowly began to weaken. Inside the broken cabin, Luke looked toward the hole where the roof had collapsed. If the tree had fallen only a few feet farther west, neither of them would have survived the night. As dawn slowly colored the snowy mountains pale blue, Luke climbed over the wreckage to inspect what remained. The destruction looked almost complete. Then something caught his eye. The fallen tree had torn away part of the old attic floor. Behind the broken beams, another narrow compartment had been exposed, not hidden beneath the fireplace, hidden above it, and inside the opening. Luke could just make out the corner of a weatherproof canvas pouch that no one had touched for decades. He climbed carefully across the broken rafters, testing every beam before shifting his weight. The fallen pine had crushed nearly half the loft, but the stone chimney still held firm, supporting the section where the hidden compartment had remained untouched. Bruno watched from below. His injured shoulder was stiff, yet his eyes never left Luke. "I'm all right," Luke called softly. The German shepherd gave one quiet huff, unconvinced. Luke reached into the narrow opening and pulled the canvas pouch free. The fabric was coated with years of dust, but remained perfectly dry beneath layers of old cedar planks. Whoever had hidden it had trusted the chimney more than the roof. He climbed down slowly. The pouch landed gently on the table that had somehow survived the collapse. Outside, dawn painted the snow-covered forest in pale gold. Inside, the cabin looked as though two different centuries had collided. Luke untied the leather straps. Inside were 3 document folders sealed in waxed paper, a leather notebook much thinner than the first, and a folded government envelope bearing the faded seal of the United States Geological Survey. He opened the envelope first. The report was dated nearly 35 years earlier. Most of the language was technical, describing rock cores, groundwater flow, and mineral samples collected from the northeastern ridge. Luke turned several pages before one sentence caught his attention. Potential extraction would permanently alter groundwater recharge feeding the South Fork watershed. He read it again, then again. The report wasn't celebrating a discovery. It was warning about one. The second folder contained correspondence, letters between his uncle and federal geologists. One name appeared repeatedly: Dr. Eleanor Hayes. Most of the pages discussed water quality, wildlife habitat, and unstable slopes. The final letter had never been mailed. Luke recognized his uncle's handwriting immediately. If this report becomes public before protections are in place, someone will buy the land long before anyone understands what they'll destroy. I'm not hiding wealth. I'm buying time. Luke slowly lowered the page. Everything Harold Mercer had said suddenly sounded different. The land isn't worth saving. Don't waste your money. Sell before winter. None of it had been advice. It had been persuasion. Bruno rested his head against Luke's leg. Luke scratched behind the dog's ears while opening the final folder. Inside lay several original survey sketches. One map showed the county boundary. Another, drawn later in red pencil, corrected it. The difference measured just under 4 acres. Exactly what the notebook had hinted. A handwritten note clipped to the survey read, "Correction withheld at owner's request, pending environmental review." No official filing followed. His uncle had intentionally left the public records incomplete. Not to deceive the government. To keep speculators from discovering the protected watershed before conservation measures could exist. Luke leaned back. He suddenly understood why every clue had pointed toward water instead of minerals. The rare deposits beneath the ridge were valuable, but they were not the true inheritance. The mountain itself was. A sharp knock echoed against the damaged front door. Luke's body reacted before his thoughts did. He stepped sideways instead of backward, automatically putting the table between himself and the entrance. Bruno stood despite the pain in his shoulder. His growl filled the broken cabin. Another knock. "Mr. Bennett?" An older voice. "Calm. County search and rescue." Luke didn't lower his guard immediately. "Who else is with you?" A brief pause. "Only me." Luke opened the door cautiously. A gray-haired man wearing a county emergency jacket stood outside beside a snowmobile. "My name's Frank Dawson," he said. "Road crew spotted the fallen tree. Figured I'd check whether anyone survived." "We're fine." Frank looked past Luke at the collapsed roof. "You've had better mornings." Luke almost smiled. "I've had worse." Frank's eyes settled briefly on Bruno's bandaged shoulder. "Good dog. The best." Frank nodded. "I also wanted to tell you something." He removed a folded newspaper from his coat pocket. Across the front page was a short article. Mercer Resources expands land acquisitions in central Idaho. Frank tapped the headline. Harold Mercer has been buying every parcel he can around these mountains. Luke looked up. How long? Nearly 8 years. Frank hesitated before adding one more sentence. And your uncle refused every offer. After Frank left, Luke stood in the doorway watching the snowmobile disappear down the mountain trail. The pieces finally fit together. Harold hadn't become interested after Luke inherited the cabin. He had been waiting for the old man to die. Luke returned to the table. He picked up the USGS report one more time. Near the final page, tucked between two folded maps, rested a business card nearly yellow with age. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, retired senior geologist. A handwritten address had been added beneath her printed information. Boise. Luke looked at Bruno. I think we know who we need to talk to. Bruno's tail gave one slow thump against the wooden floor. Outside, sunlight spread across the untouched snow. For the first time since arriving on the mountain, Luke wasn't chasing scattered clues anymore. He finally knew where the truth had been waiting all these years, and who was still alive to confirm it. 3 days later, Luke drove down the mountain before sunrise. Fresh snow still clung to the pines, and Bruno lay across the passenger seat with his injured shoulder wrapped beneath a clean bandage. The German Shepherd slept through most of the drive, waking only when the truck bounced over potholes. Boise felt louder than Luke remembered. Traffic, sirens, construction. Too many sounds arriving at once. He parked on a quiet side street, took one slow breath, and looked at the handwritten address from the old business card. The small brick house belonged to Dr. Eleanor Hayes. She answered the door herself. Her white hair was neatly tied back, and despite her age, her eyes carried the sharp attention of someone who had spent a lifetime studying details other people overlooked. When Luke handed her the government report, she didn't speak for nearly a minute. Instead, she ran one hand gently across the faded cover. I wondered if anyone would ever bring this back. You knew my uncle. I knew an honest man who made an impossible choice. She invited Luke inside. Maps covered one wall of her study. Aerial photographs, geological cross-sections, watershed diagrams. She spread the old survey sheets across her desk. The mineral deposit is real, she said quietly. But people have focused on the wrong part of the story for decades. She pointed toward a series of blue lines beneath the ridge. These fractures carry groundwater through the entire basin. If someone blasted into this formation for mining, they'd change the underground flow forever. She looked directly at Luke. The springs feeding 3 ranches downstream would eventually fail. Luke remembered the crystal-clear spring near the hidden marker. His uncle hadn't protected rocks. He had protected water. Harold Mercer knew this? Dr. Hayes nodded. He approached me years ago asking whether the reports still existed. And? I told him the truth. She smiled faintly. They belonged to the Bennett family. Luke placed the handwritten letters beside the report. They're enough? They're a beginning. She reached into a filing cabinet and removed another folder. I kept copies. Inside were signed field reports, original survey measurements, and correspondence showing that the corrected boundary had been documented, even though the official filing had never been completed. They never disappeared, she said. They were simply never recorded. By the following week, Luke found himself seated inside the Carter County Administrative Hearing Room. A surveyor, a county attorney, a Forest Service representative, Dr. Hayes, Harold Mercer. Everyone sat at the same long table. Bruno rested quietly beneath Luke's chair, wearing a blue service dog vest borrowed from a local veterans organization so he could remain beside him. Harold appeared completely confident. "This entire claim," Harold said smoothly, "relies on handwritten journals and undocumented maps." The county surveyor nodded politely. "That's why we're reviewing all available evidence." Luke placed his uncle's notebook on the table. Then the survey sketches. Then the original USGS reports. Finally, Dr. Hayes produced certified copies from her own files. One by one, the pieces began fitting together. Harold's expression slowly changed. The county surveyor compared the old measurements with modern satellite data. "They match," he said, "within inches." Silence settled across the room. Then someone dropped a heavy binder onto the floor. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber. Luke's entire body reacted before his mind caught up. His breathing shortened. The walls seemed farther away. The fluorescent lights above him blurred. For an instant, he wasn't sitting in Idaho. He was inside a concrete building overseas after another explosion. Voices faded. Someone called his name. He couldn't answer. A familiar weight pressed gently against his boot. Bruno. The German shepherd leaned calmly against Luke's leg without making a sound. Luke lowered one hand into the thick fur around Bruno's neck. The steady warmth anchored him. One slow breath, then another. The room returned. The county attorney waited patiently. "No rush, Mr. Bennett." Luke nodded. "I'm all right." He wasn't entirely, but he was present again. He stood. "My uncle wasn't hiding a fortune." His voice remained steady. "He was protecting something people downstream depend on every single day without realizing it." He looked toward Harold. "You called this land worthless." Harold said nothing. Luke continued. "You knew exactly what it was worth." The county surveyor closed the final folder. "I've seen enough." He turned toward the hearing officer. "The original boundary correction is supported by the field evidence, the archived survey records, and independent geological documentation." Harold's attorney quietly lowered his pen. No one argued. There wasn't much left to argue. As the hearing adjourned, Dr. Hayes smiled at Luke. "Your uncle would be proud." Luke looked down at Bruno. So would Duke. Bruno's tail brushed the floor once. Outside the courthouse, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time all morning. The fight for the mountain was finally over. Now Luke had to decide what kind of future he wanted to build there. Spring arrived quietly in the Sawtooth Mountains. The snow did not disappear all at once. It retreated a few feet each afternoon, revealing patches of dark earth, wild grass, and the first stubborn shoots of lupine pushing through the thaw. Luke stood outside the cabin with a hammer resting across one shoulder. It barely resembled the place he had first entered months earlier. The fallen pine had been cut into firewood. The damaged rafters had been replaced with hand-cut timbers from trees already downed by winter storms. New cedar shingles covered the roof, each one split by hand, just as his uncle had once described in the notebook. The cabin still looked old. Luke wanted it that way. Some places earned their wrinkles. Bruno trotted slowly around the clearing. The scar beneath his shoulder had disappeared beneath thick fur again, though Luke noticed the dog still favored the leg slightly on cold mornings. It never slowed him down. A pickup truck climbed the mountain road just after noon. Frank Dawson stepped out carrying a folder. "Thought you'd want to see these." Luke opened it on the porch. Inside were the final county documents, the corrected property boundary, the conservation agreement, the watershed protection designation. At the bottom of the last page sat Luke Bennett's name: owner, caretaker, steward. Not once did the paperwork mention mining. Frank leaned against the porch railing. Mercer Resources withdrew every remaining offer. Luke nodded. "I figured. The investigation into those altered survey records is still ongoing." Luke looked toward the ridgeline instead of answering. None of it mattered as much anymore. The mountain had survived. That was enough. A week later, Dr. Eleanor Hayes visited the cabin for the first time in decades. She walked slowly around the spring, smiling as she watched crystal-clear water disappear beneath the rocks, exactly as it always had. "Your uncle believed this place would outlive both of us," Luke asked quietly. "Was he right?" She looked toward the distant valley. "I think he underestimated it." Before leaving, she handed Luke one final envelope. "I found this while cleaning my office." Inside was a photograph. His uncle stood beside the cabin, much older than in the first picture Luke had discovered. At his feet sat Duke, the old German shepherd. On the back, someone had written, "A home isn't where you arrive, it's where you choose to stay." Luke pinned the photograph beside the fireplace, exactly where the hidden notebook had once waited. The seasons continued their steady rhythm. Summer filled the meadow with wildflowers. Autumn painted the aspens gold. Luke repaired fences for neighboring ranchers, guided hikers through the lower trails, and checked the protected spring every week. He never became wealthy. He never wanted to. Each evening, Bruno waited faithfully on the porch until Luke returned from walking the property. Sometimes they sat together in silence while the last sunlight settled across the mountains. Silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. The nightmares still came. Not every night, not even every week. But sometimes a distant clap of thunder or the sudden crack of a fallen branch pulled Luke halfway back toward memories he never asked to keep. Whenever it happened, Bruno quietly crossed the room and rested beside him. No commands, no words, just quiet company. Usually that was enough. One cool September morning, nearly a year after he had first opened the swollen cabin door, Luke climbed to the loft carrying his uncle's notebook. Most of the pages remained exactly as they had been. Observations, advice, warnings. He turned to the final blank page. For several minutes, he simply looked out the small window overlooking the valley. Then he picked up a pencil. Beneath his uncle's careful handwriting, he added one final entry. The mountain kept its promise. I just had to earn mine. He closed the notebook gently and returned it to the small compartment behind the fireplace. Not to hide it, to protect it. Someone else might need it one day. As Luke stepped outside, Bruno was already waiting near the old trail behind the cabin. The German shepherd looked toward the forest instead of back at the house. His ears lifted, his tail moved once. Luke smiled. You hear something? Bruno started walking, not running, not searching, simply following the same narrow path they had traveled together so many times before. Luke fell into step beside him. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine, fresh water, and warming earth. Far below, the protected spring continued its quiet journey through the mountain exactly as it had for generations. Luke glanced back one last time. The cabin no longer looked forgotten. Smoke drifted peacefully from the chimney. Sunlight rested across the cedar roof. It was no longer the worthless cabin everyone wanted to abandon. It had become the place that gave a homeless veteran his purpose, honored an old man's promise, and proved that sometimes the greatest inheritance is not what lies beneath the ground, but what is worth protecting above it. Bruno paused beside an old pine at the edge of the clearing and looked into the deeper forest. For a brief moment, the morning light caught his eyes. Luke walked over and rested one hand gently on his friend's neck. "Come on," he said with a quiet smile. "We've got a mountain to look after." Together, they disappeared beneath the towering pines as the cabin stood quietly behind them, no longer waiting for someone to save it. It had already found the right guardian. If this story reminded you that loyalty, courage, and kindness still matter, let me know you were here by leaving a simple one in the comments. And if you believe Bruno was the true hero of this story, Leave a paw print so we can see how many people felt the same way. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story is already waiting, and it might just stay with you long after the final scene. Until next time, thank you for spending part of your day with us. Stay safe, take care of the people who stand beside you, and we'll see you in the next story.